With Chapter 3, we're going to take a look at art criticism. What does it mean to be a critic of the arts? What it really means is to come to a decision about what we like, what we don't like, how we respond to a work of art, and why. Really, everybody does this all the time anyway. We always make decisions based on our choice, on our reactions to a work of art. But now we're going to move towards what we call responsible criticism. What responsible criticism means is just going for the fullest understanding and participation that's possible with any work of art. Being a responsible critic means that you want to really have a sense of awareness and approach a work of art with an open mind and maybe a little bit of background on the work of art. In reality, you're already an art critic. If I ask you what your favorite movie was of last year, I'm sure you could all answer that. But what we're going to do now is we're going to take this study of criticism just a little bit further. One of the things that's essential in training ourselves to be an art critic is what the book calls participation. What does that mean? I heard a quote a few years ago, a statistic that said that we are bombarded with over 3,500 images in a day. I would think that that number has only grown larger. So when we look at this notion of participation, it means actually getting involved with an image that we're looking at. Sometimes that involvement comes when we get more information. Sometimes if we just sit with a work of art, something changes within us. Now, this is the value of going to an actual museum, of finding a work of art that moves you deeply and considering the brushstrokes, the quality of the sculpture. Really getting quiet within and noticing how you are affected. Now, this particular piece that we're looking at here is by the artist Modigliani. He died quite young and he had a pretty troubled life. He was Italian. But he had this also very unique style. If you were studying the early history of art, you would notice that this style is heavily influenced by the Cycladic islands, the Aegean islands, which are off the coast of Greece. A very mysterious culture that left a lot of sculptures behind with the faces that looked very much like this. So maybe that knowledge would take you from thinking this was kind of a weird picture of a woman to having a deeper understanding of what it actually is. Now let's take a few moments and consider what's called the 4 stages of art criticism. This is an agreed upon collection of ideas that was created by a man named Feldman. First, we have the description. What is it? What is the subject matter? How is it made? What are the colors used? All that. Next we have the analysis. The analysis will analyze it. How do the elements work together? Now we have the interpretation. What is the content? How do we react to that content? And the judgment. How successful is the artist? This is also called evaluative criticism, and we'll get to that later. Exploring the notion of critiquing a work of art can be valuable for ourselves as artists also. Can a person evaluate their own work of art without being overly self-critical and at the same time objectively look at what works and what doesn't work in it? When I finish a painting, I always look back at it and I see what I might want to do differently. But at this point in my life, I can do that without feeling, bad about what I've done and what has worked in the painting. It's kind of a fine art to get that worked out. And I encourage any of you that have an artistic sensibility to really look at this idea of critiquing a work of art in a way that would also improve your own artwork. Okay, let's start with description. If it's a recognizable subject matter, then it's pretty simple. We can describe the various recognizable objects. Oh, there's a woman. She appears to be in a boat. Look, there's a little dog. And then we can take it further and say, oh, she appears to be in 18th century, maybe late 18th century costume, etc., etc. We can also describe, we could talk about the style, that it's in the neoclassical style, the colors, they're kind of muted, on and on. Now let's move on to non-representational art. How did they do it? It looks like a series of circles. It's what we would call op art because it creates an optical illusion. And then we could talk about the line, color, shape. These are geometric shapes, etc. So it's pretty simple. Describing a work of art is basically look at it and consider what you see and describe that. The technical qualities are also interesting. What was the medium used? Did they use, say, egg tempera, which is eggs and pigment, a very ancient form of painting that's still used to this day? Was it wood? Was it metal? Sometimes the technical qualities actually play into the work of art. For example, with an artwork that was made of recycled objects, or maybe a work of art that was made out of neon. So now we have the analysis. We're going to analyze it. The size, shape, color, texture, space. And sometimes this leads us to the content. For example, Guernica, the painting by Pablo Picasso that we looked at last week, is huge. And so that large format, I believe 28 feet long, the large format of the work helps to put it in context and helps it to have a real monumental sort of a quality, which my feeling is that that actually reflects Picasso's feeling about the slaughter at Guernica. So let's look at size. Not only do we have the monumental size of a piece such as, another example that's really funny is that during the Roman Empire, the Romans, the empire stretched all across Europe. And so what they would do is they would bring these huge sculptures of the emperor into the towns that were conquered. And when a new emperor came along, they would often just replace the head. There's these heads of the final emperor, Constantine, that are, I don't know, like 15 feet tall, just the head. So that would give the feeling of the town, remind them always that big old Rome was actually in charge. Now we have another way of looking at it. And we'll call this size hierarchical scale. Hierarchical scale. What's bigger than everything else? Oftentimes in a composition, the biggest object is what's most important or what will most draw the eye. And you can really see that here. You can also observe the size relationships to give you a sense of perspective. As things recede, as they go away from us, they also get smaller. And that gives us a feeling of depth within a painting. When you look at the early Egyptian art, they also use this hierarchical scale to have the more important and less important people. So maybe not so much from a sense of perspective, but the pharaoh would be the biggest guy in the work, and then all his little helpers would be smaller. That's just another way of looking at it. All right, shape. Now shape is a big one when we analyze a work of art. When we sit back and we say, how does it make me feel? How am I affected? The one on the left is made all with geometric shapes. So just look at that for a moment. Note your response, and then go over to the picture on the right. All organic shapes, non-geometric. They're natural, they're flowing, and I think natural is a really good word here because when you look at the natural world, there really aren't the evenly measured geometric shapes. Rather, instead, things are fluid and uneven. This painting on the left, I believe it was done by Pierre Mondrian, or else it is after his style. And he was an interesting artist who never liked to go outside. He just hated the big outdoors because it was so messy. And instead, he did these kind of geometric paintings throughout his career. Let's talk about color. Color is a lifelong study. As an artist, I find that I'm always learning and studying something new about color. The one on the right, this image, is by Henri Matisse. Matisse was a great painter of the early 20th century and the late 19th century. Well, he was part of a group of people that called themselves the Fauvists. Fauve, F-A-U-V-E, Fauvist. And that means a wild beast of color. So they took all the rules, the classical painting rules around color, and they basically just thumbed their nose at them all and made a whole bunch of crazy drawings. And this is called the green stripe. So with this painting on the right, really the subject, well, it's his wife, but it's really color. Color is the subject. Whereas we look at the painting on the left by Vermeer, who painted very photographic, sort of interior, peaceful scenes, the colors are muted. And the colors, what they do is they enhance the quality of light within the piece and are sort of secondary. Another way that we can analyze a work of art is ask ourselves about the texture. There's tactile, real texture, actual texture. For example, I get a pretty good feeling that if I touched the sculpture in the picture, it would feel rough with these kind of edges. This one reminds me of crackers all stacked up, but I think it's probably wood. And then we have illusionary or visual texture, and an easy way to visualize that would be a painting of a furry animal, and the fur looks almost real, but if you touch it, it's just pigment on a surface. Another kind of texture that I find really fun is what we call subversive texture, and this would be this one, which this is a classic example from the 1930s called the fur cup. Now when you look at that, doesn't it just make you kind of like make your mouth kind of feel funny? If you imagine putting that cup up to your lips, it's really, it's designed to do that. Here's another example, similar, of subversive texture. Okay, so this is weird, I admit. Looks like BB guns all over a car, but if you look more closely, the car is full of stuffed animals. I believe I see Miss Piggy, I see Kermit the Frog. So this is designed to juxtapose opposites and to give the viewer an unsettled feeling. Now, a person might look at that and say, gosh, I really don't like it. But if they find themselves deeply affected by it, then one would have to still call it a strong work of art. In an earlier lesson, I used an example of work that was so sweet that it didn't evoke really much response at all, except for like, ah, ah. And that's okay. That can be effective works. But perhaps I will make the theory, I'll present the theory that the strongest works of art are those that really do affect us deeply, even in a way that might make us momentarily uncomfortable. So here we have space, 3 different uses of space. In the Van Gogh with bandaged ear, it's a shallow space. It doesn't really go deep at all. If you look at Mickey on the upper right, that's flat space. Think about the work of Andy Warhol. He often uses a very flat space, and he silkscreens his images. Whereas the image on the bottom, again, this is an illusion, but the artist has created the illusion of a very deep, deep space. So that really covers the analysis of art. And now let's look at the 3 kinds of art criticism. And this is directly from the book, and you'll need to know this for this week's discussion, and you'll just need to know it for this semester in general. All right, so we've already covered some of this, but I'm going to review it because it's directly from the textbook. And go ahead and read all of chapter 3 because I've not covered everything in this lecture. Okay, descriptive. What are the actual elements of the work? What does it look like? We talked about that. So a descriptive criticism is just saying, you know, my computer is this size. It has a kind of a metallic finish. It is the one I'm working on now is a MacBook, you know, like that. So interpretive, how do we understand the work? Are we affected by the content? And I believe we've already covered that, but I'll review. How do I really respond to this work of art? How am I affected by it? When you think about some of the images that we saw last week that were disturbing, they our interpretation would be based, really, a lot of it is based on our experience. Do we have a knowledge of the history that's being portrayed there? Do we have a history? Let's think of, the two works that were dealing with guns and assassinations. Do we have a history related to that that makes these all the more troubling for us to see? So that's where interpretation comes from. The artist creates something in their own way, but then we as a viewer, well, we respond in our own way. I've done art shows for many, many years, and I would make a piece with something in my mind. I would have an idea that I would want to work out. And then I would go to the sale, and I'd be speaking with my clients and patrons, and someone would tell me about this work of art that I had painted. They would tell me their story about the work of art, their interpretation. And I learned early on that if I said, "Oh no, that's not why I painted it for this reason," I certainly wouldn't sell the work. And also I came to realize, who am I to take their story away from them? Someone might come up to me and say, "Oh, that painting reminds me of my sister who died. I really feel that she's in that work." Then they would buy the painting. So, of course, I would make a sale, but more than that, they would have this symbolic representation based on how they interpreted the work of art. It's kind of the fun part. This is where you get to figure out what you like. There's a few rules about it, and some of the videos in this week's lesson are going to kind of poke fun at that and look at what makes an art valuable and what not. So lastly, in our 3 kinds of criticism, we have this evaluative. That is the most problematic of all, in my opinion. That's my evaluation of evaluative criticism, because we're judging the merits. One of the things that I have done is I've judged many art shows in the community. I find it very difficult. I have a certain criteria. What I do is I have a list of specific criteria. Composition, subject matter, use of color, technical execution, like that. And I have to just do it very objectively, because really judging the merits of a work of art is a very challenging thing to do. So what if I knew that one of the paintings that I was judging was painted by a young man who has a degenerative disease and is a quadriplegic and paints with the brush in his mouth? Well, if I had a pure evaluation and I didn't have that information, I might not give that young artist a ribbon. But if I know that, then that will help my evaluation. So this is, valuation can be based on specific criteria, as I just said, or basically on opinions. So when I read a critique of something, I'll often pay attention to it, but sometimes not too much, because maybe I want to form my own opinion. So let's look at some interpretation. This is the meaning beyond the subject matter. Do any of you know what this is? How about Ophelia from Hamlet, who has just killed herself and drowned in the pond? That is Hamlet's love. So that's what this is. Now, this is a beautiful painting. It's a very famous painting in its own right. But let's look at another interpretation of the same image. Oh, look! It's Ophelia as a cat. So, we can evaluate and interpret a work of art in any way we want. I'll tell you, when a friend of mine sent me this image as a card, as a greeting card, I immediately knew that it was I interpreted that it was based on this famous painting of Ophelia, and I laughed and I was very tickled by it. Of course, if someone didn't know about the original painting, they would probably find this very puzzling work of art indeed. So our judgment. We have to form a judgment. Is it about the formal elements only? How we talked about this painting on the lower left in an earlier module, and they really analyzed it. It's a photograph, not a painting. But I just find it both fascinating and disturbing, because beyond how the general's arm is positioned, it's this person at the moment of death who is just been on kind of a brutal killing rampage. And for me, it's almost obscene, actually, to look at this, because it's something that we don't usually see, that moment of death. And so it's both fascinating and repelling to me. That's my judgment about this image. Now the upper right, hey, I have no idea. Looks like some plastic thing, so we'll skip over that. Is it about the formal elements? I have no idea. I have no interest, actually. It doesn't really draw me in, so I'll just move on. Now, the one on the lower right, I do have a lot of information about. Now, if you look at that, I imagine that some of you have never seen any work by this artist. His name was Gauguin, and he believed that Tahiti was a great paradise. He was French, and he was painting during the late 1800s. He worked with Van Gogh. In fact, the two of them lived together at the time that Van Gogh cut his ear off. So Gauguin believed that Tahiti was a paradise. So he went to Tahiti and he lived there for 3 or 4 years. And during that time he married a local woman much younger than him, and he painted her over and over again. She often looks very unhappy. Ultimately what Gauguin found in Tahiti was disease, social disease, which actually killed him. So I find his work on its own merits to be quite beautiful. And then when I consider his story and his use of colors and his real commitment to an ideal, I find it all the more beautiful. So when we look at judgment and interpretation, here's one that really could just evoke a question. It's by David Hockney, a famous artist of the 1970s. And if we analyze this painting, my feeling would be that it raises more questions than it answers. First, he's really kind of broken a lot of rules of composition here. There's one thing that we call a tangent. See the way this head goes right up against this? That artists tend to want to avoid that. He does it again here because it really draws the eye there. So if you have something that's coming right up against something else, as he's done right here, then that's going to really draw the eye. And you can see that. And the way he has this little triangle through here, that takes your eye way, way into the painting. At the same time, the subjects in the foreground have their back to us, and there's the empty chair that's almost inviting us in. So as we close out this week's lecture, I invite you to deeply consider the work of art, the works that you come across, whatever they are, works of literature, art, music, theater. See if you can look at your deep inner responses. Take a pause. Deeply consider. See if you can avoid moving past that flash, short attention span, look at it for a second and have only a surface understanding of it, and perhaps go deeper into the subject matter that we're going to be looking at. While I would like to answer questions, I mean, you do have a quiz after all, I would also really like to raise questions and to encourage all of you to ask questions of yourself and of the works of art, literature, music that you come in contact with. As you ask questions, you even become further engaged with each work. So that concludes the lecture for today, and as always, thank you for listening.